Good morning. I think this is going to be the last time that we talk on the subject of three godly men who were good examples for us, Noah, Daniel, and Job, of the fact that we can, as Christians, be what we should be in the world in which we live, even in troubled times. And Noah, Daniel, and Job are three men that are in the Bible that are mentioned by Ezekiel as being three men who, at the end of time, and I think we're at the last of the end time, that things are going to get bad enough that even if those three men were on earth and influencing people, they would not be able to convince anybody to walk in the truth except themselves. That was Ezekiel's prophecy where that is laid out. But Noah, Daniel, and Job were men that were approved by God, and of course Ezekiel under the inspiration of God. When he uses those three men as an example, it's interesting that they lived in bad times. Noah, of course, just prior to the flood that destroyed the population of the earth with the exception of 8 people. And Daniel, who was at the point in time when Israel was going into Babylonian captivity. And then Job, who was a man that apparently was on the earth somewhere in the time of Isaac, Jacob, in that area, as I understand it. And of whom we're told by God that he was a servant of God, that there was none like him on all of the earth, that he was a perfect man, which I understand to mean he was not sinless in his perfection, but was a mature person, and an upright man, and one that feared God and eschewed or shunned evil. And he was used by an example, by God as an example, to Satan in a meeting that we get a picture of up in what we generally call heaven, high up, somewhere above us anyway, we normally think of it. And God had a meeting with sons of God at that time, and we're told Satan came also, and God asked Satan, have you seen my servant Job? And then described Job that way. A servant of God, there was none like him on the earth. He was a mature man, an upright man, one that feared God and shunned evil, doing anything that was evil in the eyes of God. And Satan, of course, at that time that God asked him to look at the faithfulness of Job, said, yeah, all that a man has will he give for his skin. You build a fence around him, you've prospered him, he's done well. And of course, as long as you do that, why, he'll worship you, but you take away his stuff and he'll curse you to your face. And God said, okay, you can take away his stuff. And then when there was another time, God repeated, I've allowed you to take away his stuff. And it hasn't cursed me nor charged me foolishly. And so Satan said, well, yeah, but he's still got his health. So if you take his health away from him, he'll curse you. So God said, well, you can't take his life. But in essence, God said you can make him wish he was dead. And that's what Satan did. And he's described as a man being covered with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his foot. And when we pick him up when his 3 comforters, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, come to comfort him, he's sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping his boils with a broken piece of a clay pot. Just a pitiable, sick, sore, uncomfortable, probably itching, scratching, bleeding, all that comes with dealing with boils. And still he holds his integrity. However, he's troubled in his own mind and heart because he believes that God had blessed him and he believes that he has pleased God in his life, and that whether he would have described himself the way God described him, the way God described Job and his conduct, he certainly was a man approved of God, and who believed that God, who God believed loved him and was serving him. And so it was for Job hard to conceive how God would have, and Job felt, and this is probably the key. Job felt like many people do today, even, that if you're prosperous financially, economically, health wise, relationship wise, then you must be doing something right, is one of the ways I've heard it put. And if you happen to lose everything or not have anything or not be able to get ahead in life or accomplish the goals that you set for life, then you must be doing something that displeases God. But, and therefore, whether you might say our bank account could kind of indicate whether we're pleasing God or not, or our good health, or our relationships with our wives, husbands, and children might have something to do with it. But that isn't true. But that's a pretty common, and as we've looked at, that's true. I mean, that's you arrive there at that place if you're not careful reading the Hebrew scriptures, where God made a proposition to the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai that if you do what I tell you to do, I'll bless you physically, and I'll bless you in every way, shape, or form you can name just about. And if you disobey me, I'll curse you in every way, shape, or form you can think about. And Israel said, okay, we'll do it. We'll do what you tell us to do. But then they couldn't. And so then they wound up being cursed. And if you don't do what we've talked about, to study to show ourselves approved unto God, workmen that need not being ashamed, but rightly divide the word of truth, then we'll wind up saying, well, it says in there that they'd be cursed by God. It says that the people of God would be blessed by God if they did what God told them to do. So that must be the way it is for everybody. But that isn't true. That isn't rightly dividing the word of truth. And I'm not going to go back and rebuild all of that, but it's amazing to me when you look at this book for 37 chapters. That's a pretty big book. 37 chapters. Job's problems try to convince Job's comforter try to convince Job that he's hiding sin from God, or he's denying sin that he's committed, or something of that nature. And Job is saying, no, that's not true. I don't know of anything in my life where I'm guilty before God. And he wasn't. Because God's definition or a description of him was, again, a servant of God, none like him on the earth, a mature man, an upright man, one that feared God, one that hated evil or shunned evil. And both Job and his three comforters had it wrong, because the three comforters spent, again, 37 chapters trying to convince Job he had some hidden sin that either he didn't know or he was lying about. And Job himself was inclined to believe that, except Job was saying, but that's not, I haven't sinned. And Job was right. He had not sinned in that respect and to that degree. But by the time we get to chapter 38, and we're in chapter 38, we're going to look at what God has to say on the subject. And hopefully we'll finish up this subject for my part at this time today. Job 38:1, the Lord speaks to Job, and he says of Job, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Well, that's a polite way maybe to say you don't know what you're talking about. You're a just man. You may be a perfect man. You may be shunning evil. And but you don't know what you're talking about on this subject. And so he says in verse 3, tells Job, prepare yourself like a man, I'll question you, and you shall answer me. And we begin a series of questions that go almost to the end of the book. And it's interesting to me that they're questions that most of us couldn't answer. We as human beings probably can get closer to an answer to some of the questions, but some of them we're no closer to being able to answer. Job wouldn't be able to answer if he was alive and on earth today. But he starts out with, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And I won't spend a lot of time. Some of them, they're almost all pretty obvious what the question is. Who determined its measurements in verse 5? Surely you know. If you know so much about what's going on, why I do something or shouldn't have done something, then surely you know. A little bit of sarcasm on God's part. Where were you when I laid the foundations? Tell me you have an understanding. Who determined its measure? Surely you know. Who stretched out the line upon it? In other words, when you're describing the boundaries of a piece of real estate, why you sometimes use a line and you draw a line around the perimeter of the property. Who did this? God's asking Job. To what is the foundation of the earth fastened to? Or who laid its cornerstone? Or, and he gives a description, the cornerstone of the earth. And there's kind of an aside here that I'm going to comment on. Doesn't really fit the question at hand, but God describes when the cornerstones were laid for the foundations and the corners of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I suggest to you that you mark this or write it down on a piece of paper, and when you get to thinking about the first two verses in the Bible, which is Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and you read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was or became without form and void. In the second verse it says, the heavens became without form and void, or was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. The word that's translated there are two words, toho and boho, that kind of speak of destructing something that's been destroyed. And I'd like to submit that you consider the possibility that without form and void was not the way God created the earth. In fact, we're told in this statement, at the time that he created it, the stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. So something must have happened. We could talk about that, but that's for sure another subject. But he points out when the heavens and earth were created, the morning stars sang together, verse 7, and the foundations were fastened. And he asked the question, who laid the cornerstone? And at that time, all the sons of God shouted for joy. It wasn't a sad, gloomy thing on which the Spirit of God brooded, as we're told in Genesis 1:1 and 2. And he goes on in verse 9, when I made the clouds its garment and the thick darkness its swaddling band, and when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, and when I said, this far you may come but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop, then God asked Job, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you determined when the sun's going to come up, go down, that it might take hold of the end of the earth, and the wicked be shaken of it? It takes on a form like clay under a seal, and stands out like a garment. In other words, what do you know about what you think you know all about? And he goes on in 38, starting with verse 15, for the wicked, their light is withheld, and the upright arm is broken. And have you entered the springs of the sea? And then he starts asking Job about what's in the ocean. Have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? So another question about death. Do you know what happens when people go through death? What do you know about it? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Where does light come from? Do you know where that is? We don't know that now yet. And darkness, where is its place? And verse 20 says that you may take it into its territory, that you may know the paths to its home, to the home of darkness and the home of light. Do you know it because you were born then? No, Job wasn't around at that time. He didn't know, and I wasn't there, and you weren't there, and you don't know either, and we don't either. Or because the number of your days is great, have you entered the treasury of the snow? In other words, have you been around long enough that you can tell me where does snow come from? Or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? And that's kind of an interesting thing. I was thinking, as I usually do, I got up about 6 o'clock this morning and started thinking about what I'm going to be saying right now. But not the first time, but I mean the last time before I start talking. But it's interesting that God is going to use the weather and things like storms and winds and earthquakes and hail and snow when he gets ready to battle with the kingdoms of the world or Satan, that he's going to use the weather as part of his offensive war equipment. And he says in verse 23 of Job 38 that this was reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. And he goes on and asks in verse 24, by what way is light diffused? Or the east wind scattered over the earth? And in 25 he says, who divided a channel for the overflowing water, when floods come, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on the land where there is no one, and wilderness which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, and to cause it to spring forth with growth of tender grass. In other words, there's all kinds of plants and herbs and green grass and things that get watered and get germinated and grow, and where nobody is. Nobody's watching it, nobody's seeing it, nobody's doing anything about it, but it's still there. And then in Job 38, God goes on, has the rain a father? He's just asking questions about things that everybody sees and knows something about. But as to how, where, why, when, who controls it, what directs it, what limits it, how many of us know what the answer to these? We don't know the answer in most cases. We don't know the answer. Who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? And a good part of the earth at different times has been covered with ice. And the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? And the waters harden like stone, and the surface is deep is frozen. Can you bind the cluster of Pleiades? And now he's going to ask him about the planets and the stars in the sky and things I don't even, most of these are just words that I kind of think I know where they are. They're up somewhere, But beyond that, I don't know much about him, and I don't know whether Job knew any more than I do about it. But uh, when it comes to knowing all the reasons why God does something, or knowing all the reasons why somebody maybe is prosperous or maybe fails in their financial endeavors, or why their family is divided, or why their children don't love their parents, or their husbands and wives don't love each other, or to be able to answer the why. We sometimes can identify the what, but the why, we don't know. We don't know. We don't read people's hearts. We can't read their heart. God does. But anyway, he asked Job, can you bind the clusters of Pleiades, or lose the belt of Orion, or can you bring out Mazzaroth in its seasons, or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of the heaven? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Do you even know to what is their influence on all of the earth? Uh, we live in a time where we have at least one individual, and a very wealthy man, that is wanting to settle on Mars. And if he can, fine. And if people want to go, great. But I think they're going to have the same problem on Mars they have on Earth, because they're going to take people from Earth to Mars, and it's the people that have the problem. It's not the nature of things. But so again, Job, when he analyzes honestly all of these questions, he doesn't come up very good. And of course, God doesn't credit him with coming up very good either. He goes on to say, can you set the dominion over their dominion over the earth? That's where I stopped. That's in verse 33 of chapter 38. Can you lift up your voice in the clouds, that the abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightning, that it may go? No, I can't. That an abundance of the abundance. Can you send out lightning, that it may go, and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind? Another good question. Who put wisdom in the mind? How come we know what we know and can learn what we learn? And how does that work? Or who has given understanding to the heart? Or who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven? And he says in verse 38 of chapter 38 in Job, when the dust hardens and clumps and the clods cling together, can you hunt the prey for the lion? No, I don't know exactly how the lion goes about that. Or satisfy the appetite for the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven? And when the young ones cry out to God and wander about for lack of food, you know? Then we skip to chapter 39. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Well, most of us don't have a clue, and I don't suspect that Job did either. Or can you mark when the deer gives birth, or can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young, and they bow down, and they bring forth their young, and they deliver their offspring? And their young ones are healthy, and they grow strong with grain, and depart and do not return to them. Who set the wild donkey free? And it's interesting, there's quite a bit in this set of questions about wild donkeys. Who set the wild donkey free? It's as though they must have, when God created donkeys, they must have got together and began multiplying, and they just wandered away from civilization or something. Who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the ongar? And I didn't have a clue what an ongar is, and I'm not sure that I know now, except when I looked up the word, it said wild donkey. So somebody used an alternate word to describe the wild donkey, apparently. And he goes on in verse 6 of Job 39, whose home I have made in the wilderness and barren land his dwelling, and he scorns the tumult of the city, and he does not heed the shouts of the driver. In other words, the wild donkey, he's not domesticated, basically. Once you domesticate him, I guess he's not wild anymore. But and so he scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. And then God asked Job a question: will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Can you blind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes? But can you bind him? Not blind him, bind him. Or will he plow the valley behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Would you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? In other words, this is a powerful animal and he can do a lot, but he's not just running around trying to do what you tell him to do just because you tell him. And then he talks about another one of God's creation, the ostrich, in verse 13. He says, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but her wings and pinions like the kindly storks, for she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust, and she forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them, and she treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers, and her labor is vain without concern. And then he tells us why, verse 17. Because God deprived her of wisdom. Okay, she's not very bright. And did not endow her with understanding. So the ostrich is kind of foolish in taking care of its young and its eggs and things like that, because that's the way God built her. And when she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. So she's kind of a fool, but she makes fun of the horse and his rider. She doesn't give a hoot about it one way or the other. He goes on to verse 19 of Job 39. Have you given the horses strength? Well, obviously not. Have you clothed his neck with thunder? No. Can you frighten him like a locust? Is his majestic snorting strike terror? He paws the valley and rejoices in his strength, and he gallops into the clash of arms. And I think here we're describing a war horse, a horse that's trained and experienced in battle. And they get caught up in the excitement of the battle, and they hear the noise of the horses running to battle, and they want to go. He paws the valley, verse 21, and he rejoices in his strength, and he gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and the javelin, and he devours the distance with fierceness and rage, and nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. They get caught up and they're going to go. At the blast of the trumpet, he says, he smells the battle from afar. And thunder of captains and shouting, does the hawk fly by your wisdom? He switches to another animal. And he just asks Job, did you give the hawk the wisdom to fly and know where to fly and what to do? Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Do eagles mount up at your command and make its nests on high? On the rocks it dwells and resides, and on the crag of the rock the stronghold, and from there it spies out the prey, and his eyes observe from afar. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. And I think it's interesting again, just in passing, but we recently, and I am very much in favor of what I see our president Donald Trump doing, uh, and he's done a couple of military things that he encouraged and instructed the military to do. The last one being in, in Venezuela, um, Maduro in Venezuela, and it's interesting. He got this thing all together, and they rehearsed and they practiced and they were ready to go, and actually the president, understandably, was very grateful that they accomplished what they set out to accomplish without losing any of our lives in the fighting. Some other lives died that were part of it, but on the other side, but ours didn't. But I thought it was interesting. They had to wait for the weather. They were all ready to go. I commented earlier that God is going to use the weather when he comes to fighting his battle with mankind at the end of time. But it's interesting that with all the technology, all the electronic gear, all of the powerful airplanes and the ability to travel around the world and refuel in the air and all the kinds of things that we can do, carry big bombs and destructive substances and many people all at one time. Yet when they were, according to the way they described it, they were watching the weather because they were ready to go, and the first weather wasn't good. And the next day, the weather wasn't good. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was 3 days, they basically canceled or postponed their departure to go after this little project because of the weather. Yeah, yeah. And when you read in the Bible about the last days and the destruction that's going to come on the earth, included in some of that is the weather and earthquakes and thunder and lightning. And yeah, that's God's domain. And Job nor and I don't think any of the rest of us really have the ability to really answer all of God's questions on those subjects. In chapter 40, again, the Lord answered Job and said, "Shall one who contends with the Almighty correct him?" In other words, what he's trying to do is get Job to come to the place that he accepts the fact that he doesn't know enough to even formulate intelligent questions as to why God is doing or did what he did, let alone to answer the questions. He doesn't know enough to even formulate intelligent questions, but to be able to answer them, he can't say, these kind of troubles that have gone my way, Job, only come on people who have sinned. God does it, and God does it to people that have sinned. But I haven't sinned. And he was, in this instance, he was right. He had not sinned. And that's not what brought this trouble on Job at all. But what God's trying to help Job to understand, and the three comforters to understand, and you and me to understand, is we don't know much about much. We're kind of stupid when you come to why and how and where and what God is accomplishing when a lot of things happen, or how it is accomplished. We don't know. And so God is finally bringing the point to Job. Shall the one who contends, which Job was saying, but I need to talk to God because this only happens to wicked people, and I'm not a wicked person. And we have God's evaluation of Job, and he was not a wicked person. But he just didn't understand that he and his comforters don't know why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and why all of the reasons necessarily that good things happen to good people or that bad things happen to bad people. We can't answer those questions. So the question is, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? You think I did it wrong? He who rebukes God, let him answer. If you're rebuking me, Job, for the trouble you've been through, because my reason wasn't right or fair, you don't know what's going on. And Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. So Job had got the message by this point. I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. That's kind of a common, a universal sign language that I said it, you know. Yeah, you did, Job. Kind of stupid. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. He got the message. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. But God, in essence, says, I'm not through asking questions. You might be through answering, or you might come to the place you realize you really shouldn't have challenged, but I'm not through asking questions. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Or can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and array yourself with glory and beauty. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. If you're so smart, just get everything squared away. Excuse me. But of course, he couldn't do that. Then he goes on in chapter 40, hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in hidden darknesses, that's verse 13. And then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can serve you. In other words, if you can sort it all out and get it straight, then I'll agree with you that you have maybe something to say. And then verse 15 of chapter 40 says, look now at Behemoth, talk about another one of God's created animals, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. Frankly, I don't know what behemoth is. I could maybe find out, but I don't know. But it's a big one, I can tell you that. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles, and he moves his tail like a cedar, and the sinews of his thighs are tightly knit, and his bones are like beams of bronze, and his ribs like bars of iron. Pretty tough animal. I'm not sure that he may be extinct by now, but this wouldn't surprise me. Verse 19 of chapter 40 says, he is the first of the ways of God, and he only made him can bring, and only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and the beasts of the field play there, and he lies under the lotus tree, and the converts in a covert of reeds and marshes. The lotus tree covers him with their hands, and the willows by breaking brooks surrounding him, and indeed the river may rage, yet he's not disturbed. The behemoth is not. He's not disturbed. He's confident. Though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. And then Job in chapter 41 switches over to Leviathan. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? And he goes on to basically say you don't really have the ability to tame him and train him. And then he says, who is able to stand against me? So why would this is all creation of mine, God is saying. And so if you can't stand against my creation, how do you expect to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine, God says. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his great proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? He's still working with Leviathan. Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scale are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal, and one is so near another that no air can come between them. And they're joined one to another, they stick together and cannot be parted. So he's a pretty powerful animal. And then we get to Job 42. I'm skipping just a little bit in the book of Job, but go back, read it slowly, carefully. Job is going to speak for a minute. In Job 42:1, we read, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from you. Okay, it wasn't very bright. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered that I understood not. In other words, he's saying what I hope we all get from this is that we can't look at our checkbook. We can't look at the relationships in our life. We can't look at our fame or fortune and say, oh, I know I'm pleasing the Lord if it's good, or say, somewhere I sinned against the Lord if it's bad. That's not what the Bible teaches. I've uttered that I didn't understand. Things too wonderful me, which I knew not. And Job says to God, here I beseech you, and I will speak. I will demand of you and declare you unto me. I have heard you by the hearing of the ear. In other words, Job had heard God. I've heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Wherefore I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job has. So if you have any question about whether Job came out ahead of the game, he did. He came out ahead. God made it clear it was not the three brethren trying to be comforters who really became nothing but tormentors. If they'd had you might say, a godly perspective of the problem and realized that they didn't know why Job had lost his health, his wealth, his assets, his children, then they may have been able to help something, but they didn't help anything. And so he tells the two friends, take 7 bullocks and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for him will I accept. So he had God's acceptance and God's endorsement. And if they want God to forgive them for their foolishness, they needed to work through Job. And I lest I deal with you after your folly, in that you have not spoken of me the things which are right, like my servant Job. So when Job said, I haven't sinned, that's right, he hadn't. And Job said, this came down on me, and God did it, and he only does it to people that have sinned. He didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know that. That's not true. So Eliphaz the Timnite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did according to the Lord commanded, and the Lord accepted Job. And in chapter 42, we find the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Okay, so Job came out of it well paid, okay? Now, that doesn't always happen either in this life. So just because this happened for Job doesn't mean that if things go bad, you happen to be in a country that, let's say, is in war, as there are some today. And you wind up with maybe you own a house and land and barns and et cetera, and it all gets blown to smithereens. This isn't guaranteed you're going to get it back twice as big, but Job did in this case. Then came there to all his brethren and his sisters and all that had been his acquaintances before, and ate bread with him in his house, and bemoaned him and comforted him over all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Every man also gave him a piece of money, and every one an earring of gold, so that the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. So Job got more than he had when he lost it. For he had 14,000 sheep instead of 7,007. He had 6,000 camels instead of 3. He had 1,000 yoke of oxen instead of 500, and 1,000 she asses instead of 500. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters again. And he called upon the name of the Lord. He called the name of the one Jeremiah, and the name of the other Kedar, and the name of another Keth Suprath. I can't even hardly say it. And in all the land, this describes his daughters, and in all the land were no women so fair as the daughters of Job. So they were the most beautiful girls in the land, but they were also wealthy. And their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. So they not only were beautiful women, they were wealthy women. After this, Job lived 140 years, and his sons and his daughters and his sons' sons, even 4 generations he saw. So Job died being old and full of days. So he lived long enough to acquire all of the wealth and the fame and the accolades that he required to be a successful man. When he lost it all, and then he was given twice as many assets and his children back and his reputation back and his friends back, and actually he was much wiser afterwards, because he realized that just because he was successful didn't mean he was pleasing the Lord, and just because he lost all that he had and his assets and all doesn't mean that he was sinning against the Lord. He just, a lot of things going on that he doesn't know what it is and why it is and how it is, and they still exist today that way. So as I go through life, I can't look at my checkbook balance, so to speak, and say, oh, well, I'm pleasing the Lord because it's in the positive, or say, oh, I must have sinned against the Lord somewhere because it's in the negative somehow. That isn't the way it goes. And I think that it's important that we realize that, yeah, there's lots of things in prophecy that haven't been fulfilled yet that are still coming down the pike. They're still coming down the pike. And there's going to come a time when the world is going to see God deal in righteousness and justice and vengeance in some cases. And there's also going to come a time, and as I understand Scripture, before that time, when God deals in righteousness and judgment, when God's going to catch his church away and catch us up to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. And we read about that at least in 3 places, I believe, and there's probably others. And there's a lot of people that mix them up when they don't rightly divide. But 1 Corinthians 15:51, the Apostle Paul says the subject matter in the surrounding chapters is death and the resurrection. And the Apostle Paul says, I tell you a mystery. Well, a mystery is a secret, a sacred secret that God has revealed as in prophecy, maybe some way, or it does at some time, but it wasn't revealed in the earlier times. And if you look up the phrase mystery or the word mystery, you find in the epistles that it's mentioned a number of times. And in some cases, it indicates something that has not been prophesied in the 4 Gospels and was not prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures and was not prophesied before the flood, Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. And we read that we shall not all sleep or die, but we shall all be changed. Okay? Everybody's not, before the end of this time, everybody's not going to die, but we're all going to be changed. In a moment, a twinkling of an eye, the trump will sound at the last trump, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. This corruptible must put on incorruption, this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on corruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O hell, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. This was a mystery that the Apostle Paul told the church of Corinth that wasn't revealed in the 4 Gospels. The resurrection was not a mystery. The restoration of the kingdom to Israel was not a mystery. The establishment of the new covenant with Israel was not a mystery. But the fact that there are people on earth today, members of the church, which is Christ's body, who are going to be caught up to meet the Lord in the air and not die. Not die. And when the Lord comes to catch him up, according to this mystery, then the dead will be raised, and we who are alive, if we're on the earth at that time, will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. The same thing, I understand it, is talked about by the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians 4, starting with 13. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant. He doesn't say I show you a mystery, but he said, I don't want you to be ignorant. Well, they weren't ignorant of the resurrection. They were not ignorant of the restitution of the kingdom to Israel. They were not ignorant of the day of the Lord. But they were ignorant up till this period of time of the fact that there's going to be believers alive and on earth that are going to be caught up and meet the resurrected believers who have died in the heavens, and so shall they ever be with the Lord. And it was a mystery as it's described in 1 Corinthians 15:51. And it was a mystery as it's referred to as, if you don't know it, you're ignorant. And Paul says he don't want the church of Thessalonica to be ignorant concerning those who have fallen asleep, those who have died, lest you sorrow not as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord. Paul is writing, revealing something that he received from the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who sleep or have died. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. And then the exhortation is comfort one another with these words. In Philippians 3:21, I think the Apostle Paul speaks of the one who will transform our lowly body that it may be conformed to his glorious body according to the working by which he is able to even subdue all things to himself. And it's, I believe, important that we realize if there may be a lot of things that are going to happen that we aren't anticipating. There's going to be a lot of things happen that we could be and should be anticipating. And it's important that we realize just because somebody is experiencing good times and prosperous times doesn't mean they're pleasing the Lord. And just because they're experiencing bad times or troublesome times or loss of life and loved ones doesn't mean they're displeasing the Lord. And just because God allows or causes something to happen doesn't necessarily mean we have a clue as to why. And it's a good idea to realize, particularly when we try to figure out why things happen to certain people or things happen to our assets or things happen to our physical health, that we really don't know what's going on. There's an interesting thing. I in the medical field, there are a lot of things right now that have been debated by some people, very small percentage of people, throughout my lifetime, relevant to the cause of certain diseases, heart attacks and things like that. And it's interesting to me that increasingly there are people in the medical profession realize that the industry has made mistakes. That's primarily prompted by the efforts on the part of the manufacturing industry of food and manufacturing industry relevant to medicine, that's caused people to go the wrong direction in some of the recommendations made by the medical profession. And it's hard for people to make changes. I've got to my right is a bookcase. There's some books that talk about lies I learned in medical school and lies doctors tell their patients. And I think that's a little bit unfair. And those statements in the titles to those books are put there by the people that wrote the book. But I think it's unfair because a lie, as I understand it, is when you know something is wrong or one way, and then you tell somebody it's another way. Not when somebody told you the wrong thing, and being a student, you accepted it for what it was. And then later, as you practiced in the profession, you learned that's not the best way to do that. And my background is the construction business and all kinds of things in the construction business. A lot of us as young people, including myself, were taught to do them a certain way. That later on, as time went by, we learned there's probably a better way to do it. In fact, in pouring concrete, I learned some things from my two sons when they grew up, went in business for themselves, and we moved from California to Virginia, and things were done a little different back there than here. But religion and medicine and most everything else, if we don't have a source that's authorized by God, we may come to conclusions that aren't accurate. And that's what Job and his three comforters did. They came to conclusions that people lose their assets and their wealth and their fame and their fortune if they sin against God. And you lost yours, so God took it away from you, and it's because there's sin in your life. And that was not true. That was not true. I'll stop there. I look forward to being together again this coming Tuesday. May the Lord bless you. Goodbye. No, now you cancel it. Now I can't. Now I came back on.
Oh,